This is Arnold Michaelis. The conversation you're about to hear took place in the library of Adlai Stevenson's farm at Libertyville, Illinois. Governor Stevenson had invited me to breakfast, and after an exchange of pleasantries and a second cup of coffee, we got to the purpose of my visit.
Governor, I know that you've described the possibility of becoming president as a risk which every American boy must face as he grows up. And it appears that your own birth into this world was pushed by a bipartisan reaction from the family when your grandfather Davis wrote to your mother, rather teasingly, that we're all highly gratified to hear of the successful launching of this little presidential craft.
Yes, I do remember that letter now. That was my grandfather to my mother. This little presidential craft. My goodness, I don't know what he meant by that. I want you to know that had nothing to do with inducing me to ever run for president.
Well, frankly, Governor, I didn't know whether that had anything to do with your ultimately deciding to run for the presidency, or another statement by your mother, when your mother said, "In these days of moral relaxation, the spirit of love and righteousness are most necessary. I would rather have you sound physically and morally than president." Do you recall?
That's very sound advice. I better read that to my own boys.
Yes.
Mark that page.
I have it marked.
Governor, you started out to be an attorney primarily, I know. But may I ask you what brought you into government and politics?
My fellow townsman, Frank Knox, had been appointed by Roosevelt as Secretary of the Navy. And Knox, in due course, had asked me to join him as his assistant and personal lawyer, attorney, counsel. And I had done that. So that it's curious, but my advent into the federal government, from which flowed the successive events that led to my becoming governor of Illinois and Democratic candidate for president, all started with a Republican appointment.
In 1948, just before your election as governor of the state of Illinois, it appears that the townfolk of Bloomington gathered to pay you homage.
Yes.
Oh,
that was a night, most memorable night. It was a great torchlight procession through the streets, an old-fashioned thing. We had old-fashioned automobiles. They had buckboards and wagons and buggies and people in the costumes of the 90s, and it was a most wonderful political rally I've ever been to, was that one in Bloomington that night. The people marched all the way from my grandfather's old house, which is still standing up on Franklin Square, down the main street of the town to the courthouse. There they had a platform rigged up, and we had speaking in the night. Oh, it was a great show.
Well, I want to throw a few of your words back at you that you uttered that night that I think are particularly significant.
I didn't think what I uttered that night had survived, has it?
Well, you lend an ear, and I think it'll have meaning for you. I have Bloomington to thank for the most important lesson I have learned.
Yes.
That in quiet places, reason abounds. That in quiet people, there is vision and purpose. That many things are revealed to the humble, which are hidden from the great.
I wish I could claim authorship for the last sentence, that many things are revealed to the humble that are hidden from the great. I can't. I heard it once uttered by a man in the United Nations, a representative of a small country, and it comes from the profound philosophy of that land. But it's a great phrase, and it's very, very true. I think it's one of the root phrases of the democratic faith, that you have to believe that it's in the multitude, in the long term, that we can rely on their decisions and their ultimate justice and their ultimate wisdom, as Jefferson said.
Governor, it seems that some of your friends feel that whenever you utter the word Illinois, that you give it a special loving kind of sound, and that people begin to feel a little wistful because they didn't grow up here. Now, just why does Illinois involve you in giving it a special loving sound?
Well, I don't know. I suppose it's home, isn't it? It's where I've lived always, and my mother and father both were born and lived, and their parents before them. I love Illinois. Its sounds, its sights, its music, its reverberations, its wealth, its might, its majesty, its beauty has meant much to me from infancy. And I've traveled all over it from corner to corner. I've been its governor. I've come to know its peoples. I've been in every one of its counties. I've even had the privilege of seeing half a century of its enormous growth. and I love it. I said in my welcoming speech to the Democratic Convention in 1952 something like, we who live here in Illinois, because it's flat and because it looks in all directions, we see and hear it from all directions. And I think there's some truth in that about the Middle West, and especially about this sort of crossroads of the Middle West in Illinois.
Well, Governor, in 1948, when you were designated as the Democratic nominee for the office of governor of the state of Illinois, you went on to campaign and then became governor, elected governor, by the largest majority ever given to a candidate in this state. It was your first elective office, and you had suddenly become the governor of 9 million human beings. I wonder what your reaction was at the thought of having become the governor of 9 million people.
I think that my feeling was almost more sharp and sudden at the time I decided to run for governor of 9 million people. And you spend all of your time, 18 hours a day, and I mean that literally, informing yourself about the problems of these 9 million people and who they are and what they are and where they live and what they do and how they live and breathe and think and have their being. This becomes your total preoccupation, so that becoming their governor, which has been your objective, as it was in my case, for 10 solid months of incessant travail and travel, left very little for the transition from the campaign to the election. Much of the emotional suddenness of the impact of victory had been discounted by the long period of preparation.
I was thinking about the feeling that you would have the responsibility of guiding the lives of 9 million people. I wonder what it would be if it were increased to 170 millions.
Yes.
Can you ponder that with me for a moment?
Yes, I have. I tried to ponder it in writing and orally in my acceptance speech at the time I ran in 1952. I said of the presidency that the burdens of that office stagger the imagination. Its potential for good or evil now and in the years of our lives smothers exaltation and converts vanity to prayer.
Governor, after you had been nominated for the presidency in 1952, you repaired to Lincoln's house in Springfield. You sat in Lincoln's study alone for an hour. And I'd really be interested if you could tell me what some of your thoughts were at that point.
Well, I was nominated here in Chicago on a Friday night, and then followed all the commotion of the succeeding 2 days, and I finally got back to Springfield on Monday the following week, pretty exhausted and also beset with the infinite problems that had suddenly fallen on me like the moon and the stars, and therefore found me totally unprepared. And when I returned to Springfield and was suddenly confronted with the enormous responsibility that was now mine, and the infinite number of things that I had to do, commencing literally from scratch, without even an office, without a manager. I had to get ready, and I had to face this enormous job and do it as well as I could, conscientiously. And I don't know, I just was overwhelmed, and I got up and told the state policeman at the door of the mansion that I was taking a walk. And I walked over to Lincoln's home and knocked on the door and woke up the caretaker who lives there and said, "This is Governor Stevenson, I want to come in and sit a while." Because who had suffered more acute mental anguish, at least in my ken, than Abraham Lincoln in his times of crisis there in Illinois, and in that very house. And it was a great comfort. I just went in there and sat down for a while, and I didn't sit in the study, I sat in the living room, on the ground floor on the left as you go in one of those old horsehair stuffed chairs, rocked there for a while in the dark, and it was very, very refreshing and very reassuring. And to reflect on the miseries of that man's life, to reflect on the difficulties that he met and surmounted, with less advantages, with less opportunities, with less comforts indeed than I had, I think perhaps opened hidden sources of strength that I didn't know I had. I'm surprised that you even know about it.
Well, it's a thing of significance to all of us to know of your identification with what emerges to you as the image of Lincoln. What about your identification, particularly with the humor of Lincoln?
Well, I think having been raised here in the sort of Lincoln tradition because of his intimacy with my great-grandfather and the many interconnections between Lincoln and my family back in the early days, I had heard and read and thought much about Lincoln and his life here on the prairies of Illinois, and as a result of that, inevitably you get into the humor aspect of Lincoln, the tremendous resource that he had both of illustration in human relations, and I think in personal encouragement. A man who had suffered and lived as difficult a life as he had to have resources to survive it all, and to survive with the equanimity, the balance, the good judgment, and the everlasting beauty of his life. And I think he found much of his solace in humor. But there was an attitude current at the time about Lincoln's humor, which was an attitude of derision, of mistrust, at least by some people.
I guess we have to recognize that there's abuse for humor or abuse for intelligence. And since you appear to be both the humorist and the egghead in one, I was particularly struck with the lines Jan Strutter, who unfortunately passed away.
Yes, I never knew her, you know. She used to write me, but I never met her.
Well, this one poem...
Great writer, wasn't she?
She was indeed, and this one poem she had written about your speeches, I think, epitomizes the whole premise.
Well, I'd like you to refresh my recollection about it. Yes.
She said, John Doe, he heard a speech. It didn't plead, it didn't preach. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It didn't treat him like a child. It even carried one or two words he hadn't known he knew. John Doe scratched his head. John Doe smiled and said, Richard wouldn't understand, but as for me, I think it's grand. Richard Roe, he heard it too. Listened hard the whole way through. It made him feel he wasn't dense. Addressed him like a man of sense. It made him feel, I'm not a fool, I still remember stuff from school. Richard Roe, he rubbed his eyes with a kind of proud surprise. 'Tisn't quite in Johnny's line, but as for me, I liked it fine. Doe and Roe met face to face just outside the polling place. Well, what's new, said Doe to Roe. Nothing much, said Roe to Doe. What do you know, said Roe to Doe. Not a thing, said Doe to Roe. In they went and out they came, looking just about the same. He and he alone, thought each, had really understood that speech.
Well, isn't that one?
And bless her for writing those lines.
Well, bless her indeed. I remember them so well now. Well, I think there has been a good deal of that about my speeches, but I'm also very sure that what she said is true, that a lot of people suspected the other person of not understanding what I was trying to say. What makes me happiest, however, is that nobody wrote a verse asking whether I understood what I was saying.
It was assumed that you did. One of the things that interested me was your closing statement in the Gridiron speech in '52 about what happened to you on the way to the White House. I had a good laugh over it. I also was moved to do a little deep thinking about the reference that you made to him at the close of the speech, where you said, never was the responsibility of the majority press greater to make clear that it is concerned about the freedom of all Americans and not merely about its own liberty to agree with itself. Your typewriter is a public trust. The sound may be the most beautiful noise you know, but it has meaning and justification only if it is part of the gloriously discordant symphony of a free society. And that impressed me very deeply, Governor.
It's very good, I think. I liked that paragraph enormously. I got great satisfaction out of it. It was one of those moments of reward.
You said at one point that man does not live by words alone, in spite of the fact that he sometimes has to eat them. And I wonder if you'd like to eat your own quote of Socrates in the Gridiron speech, when you said that Socrates said that the duty of a man of real principle is to stay out of politics.
Socrates was something of a cynic, but it's a question of the reconciliation of survival in politics with the courage of conviction. You remember the wonderful remark of the, I won't presume to say which senator of the United States it was, who once said, there's a time when all of us must rise above principle.
Yes. And who else was it who said, many the time a completely innocent individual is sent to the legislature? Again, getting back to that wonderful phrase, gloriously discordant symphony of our society.
This is the difference between a democratic and a tyrannical society.
Exactly, and I know that this will interest you. An address by Lord Moulton, the late Lord Moulton, in the House of Lords one day, shortly after the general strike in Britain following the First World War. He put all of human activity into 3 separate domains. On the left, he put the domain of free choice, whim, or uncontrolled discretion. On the right, he put the domain of law, the law of the land, the city, the state, of the nation. Now, in between the two, he put the domain of manners. And here, he said, one is obedient to the unenforceable. And then he went on to say that whenever there is an attempt to extend the domain of free choice into the domain of manners, there was a counteraction to extend the domain of law into the area of manners.
You mean to press back? It's very interesting. As unrestrained free choice invades the domain of manners, law invades from the other side.
Exactly.
To press it back, and the area of manners is pretty soon all occupied.
And of course, then we have totalitarianism.
Yes, I think that phrase that manners is obedience to the unenforceable is very good. We have so many instances of that, don't we, where custom and habit have to prevail just by the sanction of society rather than the sanction of law. I think it has to do with the present problem that we confront with respect to desegregation of the schools. The problem of enforcement, which we talk about so much nowadays, becomes a very difficult one indeed, translated into terms of what we mean by enforcement, which usually is coercion. It's usually the police, it's the troops, it's the bayonets, and so on. We can't think about social adjustment in those terms, because this is basically social adjustment.
I noticed your sister observes that you, at an early age, developed the gift for listening.
Is that a gift?
Well, it must be, Governor, because few people do it, I have found. If listening is a gift, what do you think you really have to do to listen effectively?
Listening isn't easy. It isn't easy, especially if you live in this extrovert world that I've gotten into here in these recent years. But I think to really listen, you have to think not only what he's saying, but you also have to understand what he means. And what he says and what he means are sometimes, in view of the deficiencies and the inadequacies of self-expression, are not always the same thing.
Well, you've just defined the necessity for calling listening a gift. In line with that, I'm reminded of the story that a friend of yours tells that one day in Chicago when he was driving down Michigan Avenue with you, his car stopped at a traffic light, and the driver of a truck alongside called out, "Hi, Adlai," and you apparently talked very pleasantly until the light changed. And then as your car pulled away, your friend asked you where you had met that man, and you said you didn't know, really. And he said, "Well, you two seem friendly enough." And you said, "Oh, well, he wasn't being friendly with me. He was talking to Adlai."
Yeah.
Now, I'm interested in your pointing out that duality.
Well, I didn't mean that by anything very complicated or abstract, but when you're prominent and your name is in the papers and your picture all the time, and emotions have been stirred up, allegiances have been developed, you've been in combat, so to speak, and you develop all sorts of friends that, march in your ranks, and they have a wonderful, warm way of referring to you by some endearing appellation, be it your first name or maybe some very unpleasant nickname, I don't know, but in this case it was Adlai. Well, Adlai meant something to this fellow. I meet him all the time. I get on the train in the morning and some fellow comes up alongside and shake hands and says, "Adlai, he may be a workman, or a brakeman, or he may be a commuter, or whatever," and I'm just a public figure to him. My little boy said, "Gee, don't you wish they'd call you Joe DiMaggio?" And we feel a camaraderie in this country. We don't, I don't believe we have too many people up on pedestals, and we meet one of the people who have become a sort of commonplace word to us, and somebody we like, well, we talk to him. That's what that fellow was doing.
Yeah.
It wasn't me somehow as an individual that he knew well. This was Adlai.
Well, do you have any objectivity about the projection of this individual known as Adlai? Because you may not be what you think you are, but what you think you are. Now, Governor, what do you think you are?
My goodness, that's the hardest question. There's no searching, desperate question. And I hope you won't think this a frivolous remark. I like to think, I like to think that I'm a high-minded, decent, enlightened citizen who's trying to do something, trying to play his part in his generation, play it well, play it fairly, play it squarely, and move on to my place in the shadows, having left behind something better than I found. This is what I'd like to think.